Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 8 game from the Southwest class. Now, if you followed the last few rounds, you know that I've actually won 2 games in a row in rounds 6 and 7 after losing 2 games in a row in rounds 4 and 5. So I recovered nicely and got out of the doghouse, and this was going to be another opportunity to kind of right the ship and finally play up. So I had, done my job playing down the past few rounds, and now I got a shot to play against a Grandmaster. And my opponent in this one was Bartlomej Maceija. I'm sure I'm bludgeoning that name. A lot of people call him Bartek for short. That's kind of his nickname. But he's actually a very, very highly esteemed Grandmaster, originally from Poland. I believe he's a former European champion, but he's been living in the United States for some time now, coaching at the university level. He's the coach of one of these chess schools, as I call them, that offers full-ride scholarships to talented players. I believe this school's in Texas. It's called University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley or something like that. UTRGV is the acronym. So Bartek doesn't play as much these days because he's coaching a lot, but he does travel with his students to these events. So sometimes he winds up playing the tournament with them. So in any case, I was white and I was hoping to keep the good play going. And here was my shot. So I went d4. Bartek went knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and c5. And c5 was a huge surprise to me because normally when your opponent goes for c5, there are 2 variations that can come up. Either a pure semi-terrace that would happen after c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, more exchanges, and then bishop b4 check. And these type of lines are known to be fairly solid for black. White has a center, but black has pretty easy development and has managed to trade 2 pairs of minor pieces to alleviate the lack of space. So this is one way black can normally play that position after c5. And then another way black could play the position, and the one I was actually worried about, was actually after c takes d5, black can even play c takes d4. And after, I think, queen takes d4, there's some line I was concerned about. What was it? I don't even remember right now. It was e takes d4. Yeah, there was this line with like e4 and knight c6 and bishop b5. And quite frankly, I just did not know enough about this line at the time that I felt confident going into it. Unfortunately, I probably should have not feared this too much because white gets a position normally like this that's fairly solid. So this wasn't something I should have been fearing necessarily, but I was worried about very targeted prep in a line that I hadn't looked at in several months. So because of that, I went for the very timid e3. And e3 isn't necessarily a bad move on the face of it, but the issue is that it doesn't really challenge black's setup. And to add insult to injury, it gives me an isolated pawn, which I'm not a fan of. Because after c takes d4, e takes d4, now I have to play with the IQP, as it's called, the isolated queen pawn. And I just wasn't keen on doing that because you basically have scenarios where white has to pretty much attack on the king side to justify the IQP. And so, but it becomes a long-term vulnerability. These aren't the type of positions I like. I prefer to have positions where I have long-term assets, not short-term assets. And black kind of tricked me into a position where I have the short-term assets. So, yeah, I got outplayed from the opening here. Anyways, there's still plenty of game to go. Bishop b4 was played, just pitting the knight. And I went c takes d5. You might wonder why not c5, just saying, you know what, you're not going to have the isolated pawn now. Now you push the pawn and aren't you fine? And the issue is that black can easily undermine the structure by going b6 eventually. And the point is that my d-pawn will be an isolated pawn sooner rather than later because I won't be able to hold this construction together, because b takes c5 would be a threat. So that's one issue. The other issue is when you relinquish the tension in the center, Black can actually go knight e4, and this pin could be annoying on the d2 knight, on the c3 knight. In particular, when a move like bishop d2 would just forfeit the bishop pair. And we all know how I feel about the bishop pair. So those things I just wasn't a huge fan of. Instead, I went c takes d5, and that's kind of the principled move, but now I have to play the isolated pawn position after knight takes d5. And I just don't like these. And you could see that I kind of strayed very quickly from the things you're supposed to do, because I almost tried to play the position positionally instead of aggressively. First thing, I went bishop d2. Bishop d2 is not the square you want your bishop on normally in these structures, and it's just not very good. To defend that pin, I probably should have just gone queen c2 and called it a day, but I went bishop d2. And the bishop here is just not very good. It gets in the way of my protection of the d-pawn, and it's just a purely defensive piece here, so not the best move. Black played knight c6, good move, developing, eyeing the d4 pawn, and now I played bishop b5, another poor move. The point is that I'm not really threatening the bishop takes c6, and so, my bishop really is not served well here. Instead, it should be back on d3, where it's eyeing the king side and that h7 pawn, which is normally the sensitive pawn that black has on the king side. And then I can think about, even getting some Greek gift ideas. By Greek gift, I mean like bishop d3, castles. Sometimes there's this idea of knight g5 and queen h5 and checkmate like that, and that's called the Greek gift. Here it wouldn't work, though, because the knight can just go back and defend the square. But that's something that you have to at least think about. So you could see that with my bishop moves, bishop d2 and bishop b5, I just don't really have a great handling and understanding in this position. I think I was kind of honestly hoping for a6. Point being is that after a6 now, taking on c6 makes more sense, because at least this light squared bishop can't get out to a6 very quickly. And also there's some really weak dark squares in black's camp. And so a move like knight e4 could perhaps take advantage of some of them, and my knights would have good outposts on c5 and e5. So this would be some type of dream scenario with the IQP, where you see my d4 pawn is just as weak as the c6 pawn, but no more weak than that. And I have nice outposts for my knights, but very, very unrealistic. Black did not allow me all these pleasantries and just castled, which is very reasonable, because now if I take on c6, black hasn't actually played a6, so the bishop could pop out here very quickly and take advantage of my weak light squares. So I didn't take on c6, I castled. But you could see my escapade to b5 did not make sense. Now black played knight ce7, very good move, shifting this knight over to the king side and reinforcing the one on d5. So you could see they're kind of protecting each other, because in this position after castles, I was actually threatening knight takes d5. So if we just back it up a moment here, if black makes a nothing move like h6, I have knight takes d5. And now this b4 knight is a little bit loose, or this b4 bishop is a little bit loose. And after a move like queen takes d5, black would actually lose a piece to bishop takes c6, because now this bishop is hanging and this queen is attacked. So there was a little minor tactical idea, but, grandmasters are not going to miss stuff like this. And knight c7 was an excellent way to just deal with that and protect everything. I went queen b3, again, trying to justify my setup a little bit, eyeing this bishop on b4, putting some more pressure on the knight on d5. But now the black bishop just moves away and goes to d6. And here it's actually on a new diagonal, and it's quite effective, and it served its purpose on b4, so it's like, now I can just move away and move to a new front. So really good judgment by black. I went rook e1. This is a normal move in IQP structures. You play the rook to e1. On a good day, maybe you'll go to the h file or the g file and checkmate. But this was not one of those days. I mean, it didn't seem very realistic for my rook to get over there and do anything. The other idea with rook e1 is to potentially reinforce a knight on e5, so that you don't have to necessarily take with the d-pawn, you can take with the rook. Knight takes c3 was played. And I think this move is actually a very, very instructive one, because it illustrates just how precarious the IQP structure is. Because you might say, why are you actually taking on c3? Doesn't that make sure that the d-pawn isn't isolated? And the truth is that it does. I can play b takes c3, and I actually did do this. But the issue is now after b takes c3, I have new problems. Namely that my c and a pawns are split. So I actually still have 3 pawn islands. So it's kind of funny that in this position I had 3 pawn islands, and even after the d4 pawn is supported, I still have 3 pawn islands. And now because these pawns are split, black has excellent counterplay on the c file when the rook gets to c8. So you can see here that, the structural damage that white, is dealing with is really, really problematic and is just enduring the whole game. And this is really why you really want to get an attack going on the king side. But you can see I've sufficiently misplaced my pieces where that's not really going to happen. So I was really not pleased here, but it is what it is. So anyways, b6 was played. Excellent move. Now preparing bishop b7 and rook c8. And you can see now these bishops will be pointing and bearing down on my king side. And then this rook would also be really nice on the c file. And meanwhile, my queen and bishop are doing absolutely nothing on this side of the board. So I kind of move quickly to try to rectify the situation. I start with bishop d3, getting that bishop back to the diagonal it should have been all along. And then after bishop b7, which attacks my knight on f3, I actually just went queen d1, which you might say is, wow, that's very radical, moving your queen back to the original square. But the point is I wanted to get my pieces going to the queen side as quickly as, or the king side as quickly as possible. And, even though this was somewhat unusual, I thought it was the right thing to do. But it just goes to show you that black kind of has their pieces much better placed than I did, and I had to kind of regroup just to stay in the game. So anyways, knight f5 was played. Great move. This knight is an excellent outpost, here, and it does the dual job of also blocking my bishop from eyeing the h7 pawn. Note that a move like bishop takes f5 would double black's pawns, but would render me with a much worse position because my light squares are so weak. And actually, this f5 pawn does a good job actually covering one of the squares, so I could easily imagine a rook or a bishop eyeing this outpost at some point. So taking that knight and to double the pawns would have not been a good decision. And I know better than to give my bishops like that. So instead, I went knight g5. And my idea with knight g5 was to think about going knight e4 and hitting this bishop on d6, but also queen h5. There was also some scenarios, actually, where I was even thinking about knight takes h7. Point being that if king takes h7, there's sometimes a moment where g4 can be a possibility, but here my king would be too naked for that to be realistic. After knight g5, black went queen c7, eyeing this h2 pawn with check, and I had to make a decision here. I had to decide how to defend this pawn. I wasn't super enthusiastic about h3, which seems like a natural move. Reason being, I was a little bit wary about h6, and then after knight e4 driving my knight away, I was really concerned with bishop h4 check, king h1, and bishop f4. I thought this maneuver would do a great job of undermining my pawn on c3, so that after these dark square bishops are traded, not only do I have some weak dark squares to contend with, right? Like if something like this happens, I have weak dark squares on the king side, but also the c3 pawn is weak. So I thought this type of exchange is not something I should allow. So because I didn't want to allow the trade of the dark squared bishops, instead of playing h3, I went for g3. But g3 is extremely double-edged and extremely, extremely risky because what it does is it opens up this light square diagonal forever. And so my king is permanently weak. But I thought it was, I was choosing the lesser evils, and I thought this was the lesser evil. It turns out I was wrong because right away, black first goes bishop e7, challenging my knight on g5. I went queen h5, trying to threaten mate. And now I expected h6, and then my knight was going to relocate to e4, block off this bishop on b7. I thought all is okay. I'm surviving, and there's not going to be a checkmate because my knight, there's not going to be a queen-bishop battery because my knight is in the way. Well, after queen h5, Bartek played the brilliant bishop takes g5. And if you think about it for a little while, you realize it's kind of the move, the obvious move, but it wasn't so obvious to me because I have this two bishops fetish, right? So, I was like, oh, there's no way that he's going to give up his bishop pair. That would be bad. But here it's totally justified because this diagonal is so open that, if he's able to get this battery with queen c6, I'm just done. So I have to take the bishop back, queen takes g5. And for the time being, queen c6 isn't a threat because I could block with bishop e4. But now he played knight d6. And the point is that now that knight is covering the e4 square and just preparing queen c6. So I'm in a really tough spot because it looks like queen c6 is going to happen almost against anything. And so I had to move fast to create something. And I decided to try to create some threat of my own by going queen h4. And the idea with queen h4 is just to threaten mate in 1. And I thought that maybe in this type of position I could fight a little bit because if black plays a move like h6, which seems, like a way to try to, keep the game, try to stop me from checkmating, I thought that I might have potential sacrifices with bishop takes h6 or even potential ideas with playing f3 right away. Point being is that after I play f3, if bishop takes f3, now maybe there's some idea with bishop takes h6. I'm not sure this works, but at least this was something that I was thinking about going for, trying to play checkmate like this. And at least I get some pawns for the piece, because if you make a move like f5 to defend the checkmate, now this e6 pawn hangs. So again, this looks very, very fishy, I admit. But this was the type of thing I was thinking about when I played queen h4. And I must say I was a little bit happy when I saw black's response here, f5, because now after f5, I have a target to play with, the e6 pawn. So the e6 pawn is not yet hanging. I can't go rook takes e6 because queen c6 comes, but I can get just enough counterplay to stop the checkmating threat. And so I played queen f4 here. And the idea with queen f4 is that I'm pinning this knight, and now after black's reply, queen c6, I can play f3. And this is the big point, that if queen takes f3 now, I could trade queens and take on e6. So, yeah, so it seemed like I was getting somewhere, and I was actually not going to get checkmated right away, which, to be honest, was a relief. The issue, though, is that even though I'm not getting checkmated, my structure still sucks. Black still has 2 pawn islands to my 3 pawn islands, and my bishops are really, really not doing anything. My bishop on d2 is a purely defensive piece, and my bishop on d3 is severely restricted right now. And my pawn structure is just so bad and can be easily blockaded on the light squares. And now black goes for this type of plan by going knight c4. After knight c4, I'm pretty much obliged to take on c4. But now you could see this bishop and queen do an excellent job of just blockading my dark squared pawns, and I just can't get anything going. And meanwhile, black has all the space and time in the world to improve on the queen side by playing like bishop d5 and rook c8 and maybe doubling rooks. There are even scenarios where an exchange sacrifice on c3 might be warranted. So I really have not much play to speak of in this position, and even my king is weak because of the construction of my pawns on the king side. So I'm in a tough spot. I mean, this is a position I think, I should lose 9 times out of 10, but the idea was to try to make it difficult on black. And so my mindset was, okay, I have weaknesses, but my objective should be to try and get rid of some of them, or at least to get some counterplay. And so my first order of business was my move a4. And the idea with a4 was to get rid of this isolated a pawn and potentially have some open files for my rooks because I can't just sit and do absolutely nothing. Black played bishop d5. I think that's a reasonable move. Again, cementing these pawns on d4 and c3 and also reinforcing the protection of the e6 pawn. So very good move. And now I went a5, trying to get some counterplay on the queen side. I was a little bit surprised by Black's move, I must say, because I thought b takes a5 was logical. Point being that after rook takes a5, Black now has a passed pawn on the a file that, while it might not be pushed right away, I think long-term could be a problem. So I thought something like rook c8 here would be good, just stopping rook c5. And then let's say I play let's say I play rook a1, a6. And I thought an idea with Black going rook b8 and potentially invading on the b file would actually just be winning. So it's connected with the fact that, again, this a pawn is an outside pass pawn, and you could see my extra pawn on this side of the board isn't going anywhere as long as this light squared bishop is blockading it. So I was really surprised that b takes a5 wasn't played because I thought strategically it puts me in a tough spot. Instead, Black played b5, and I was kind of happy to see this because now I played a6. And the point is that even though this pawn, maybe isn't going anywhere anytime soon, I'm fixing this a7 pawn as a weakness on a dark square, so it might be a target for my dark squared bishop later. Additionally, pawns that are really far advanced can be dangerous, so now it's something that Black has to worry about. The other thing that I was thinking about is even if Black tries to win this pawn, it might sufficiently distract him enough that I get counterplay on the king side. So I thought, from a practical standpoint, a6 was a good move. Black played h6, getting some, giving this king some luff potentially, and I don't know, just an effective waiting move, I guess. And here I played actually h4, and this looks super crazy, but again, I'm trying to, create some misdirection. And actually, the point with h4 is that in some lines, g5 was something I would have to worry about because there were some lines where I was worried about g5, g4, ripping open the light squares. And now with h4, I stop any g5 ideas. And I potentially think about playing h5 in the future, fixing these pawns on the king side on the dark squares. So you can see with my rook pawn moves, I'm just trying to mix things up just a little bit. Black played rook b8, I guess going for the a6 pawn, and maybe in some lines thinking about b4. I went for king f2. Again, I don't really have much I could do here, so king f2 was kind of like just a cheeky waiting move. Rook b6, going for that a pawn. Rook b1, trying to eye the b5 pawn because now if Black wants to win the a6 pawn, they're going to have to get multiple pieces to the 6th rank. So I thought that if I put some pressure on the b pawn, maybe I can win the b pawn for the a pawn. Rook c6, rook c8, fair enough, getting that rook to the c6 square potentially. And now king e3. King e3 is a very, very ugly move and not a move that you want to play, but I was really wary of the queen invading with queen d3, so I thought with the king on e3, I'm at least covering that square. The issue is, though, tactically, e5 might be a nasty shot at some point because I can't play queen takes e5 because of rook e6. So look out for that shot a bit later. Queen c6, again, eyeing this a6 pawn. And now rook a5, eyeing the b5 pawn. So I'm thinking, all right, if I trade the b pawn for the a pawn, maybe I'm still holding on. But you can see here that the difference in activity is astounding. My bishop on d2 is terrible compared to the one on d5. My queen is weirdly placed. My king is in the middle of the board. Really, really a nasty position. Bishop c4, good move, protecting the b5 pawn, reinforcing the rook takes a6 threat. And now I went rook a1, just defending this pawn. But look at how passive white is. I think Black could probably win this game, if he had more time. It was actually, I was quite fortunate here that I was actually up like 30 or 40 minutes. So another plan of attack was to just play as quickly as possible so that this position would be difficult for my opponent to convert. So anyways, queen d7, king f2, and now king h7. And this told me that black was actually not entirely sure of how to break through. These moves were helping black get to the time control because in this tournament, there was extra time, I think an extra 30 minutes at move 40. But again, these moves aren't really incisive. And so now was my job to just try to create some counterplay while black wasn't really doing very much. And I decided to play h5. I really like this move because not only do I fix these pawns on the dark squares, now this king is kind of boxed in potentially, and I was already thinking about scenarios where I might try to get some counterplay on the g file with a rook to g1 and g4, as strange as that looks, because now this bishop on c4 is not eyeing the f3 pawn anymore, and I was thinking that if black goes to win the a6 pawn, he might be sufficiently distracted where playing g4 won't weaken my king too much. So I got very excited here that I was getting just enough counterplay to make things interesting. Black played bishop d5, shifting the bishop back to the f3 square, and then I was like, okay, all right, fine, maybe g4 is not going to be on the cards right away. And so I went rook e1, just kind of saying, you know what, a6 is no longer attack right now. That's fine. I can shift my rook to a more active square. Rook c6, attacking that pawn again. And this was kind of what I was waiting for. I was kind of baiting black into attacking the a6 pawn so that I can get my own counterplay, which I got off now with g4. And this was kind of the fruition of my flank pawn moves with a6 and h5 and now g4, and it seems like I'm getting just enough play. Note that if the rook was anywhere close to the king side, g4 would not be an option because my king would just be too weak on the f-file. But because the rooks are kind of distracted, I have time to get my own counterplay off. And the threat actually is not g takes f5, but actually g5. So let's say rook takes a6 is played. After rook takes and rook takes, I can actually go g5. And now I'm actually threatening g takes h6 with some very, very menacing ideas on the black king. So, and note that a move like h takes g5 just gives me the g file to work with. So all of a sudden, black has to be careful. After g4, black took f takes g4, and I went queen takes g4 to keep the g file open. And yeah, I was getting some play now. Now you could see at least my bishop is finally open to do some stuff here. My queen is playing, and now even my rook might come to g1. So I'm back in business. Queen f7 was played to cover the queen g6 check idea, and now I went for rook g1. And then king h8 was played, and king h8 I actually think was not a good move. I think he was trying to deal with queen g6 check as a threat, but I think the medicine or the remedy is actually worse than, or let me say the solution was actually worse than the problem, because a scenario where I'd have to trade queens with queen g6 check is probably not ideal. Note that if like rook takes a6, a trade here, and then queen g6 check, after this trade, the king can just go back to g8, and now my rook is kind of shut off here, and my bishop is still weak, and now black has two pawns on the queen side that are very, very dangerous, not to mention the fact that my g6 pawn might be a weakness. So actually, queen g6 check wasn't quite a threat, and since it wasn't a threat, king h8 wasn't necessarily a move that black needed to play. The other issue with king h8 is that with the king on h8, now that it's on a dark square, if my bishop gets to this diagonal, this pawn is going to be pinned, and I might hit the h8 king with check. So I rushed very quickly to get that going. First with rook g3, protecting my f3 pawn, and then after rook c8, playing bishop f4. And the point is now that if my bishop gets this beautiful e5 square, all of a sudden I have three attackers converging on this g7 pawn, and just a lot of counterplay. So already here I thought, you know what? I'm probably going to hold this game because all of a sudden my bishop is becoming just as active as the light squared bishop was. And, you know, like we say in these opposite colored bishop positions, it's usually the side that is the more active bishop that has the advantage, or at least the initiative. Now, bishop f4 was a pawn sacrifice because I am giving up the c3 pawn. And that's actually why I played rook g3 before playing bishop f4. Because in this position, if I played bishop f4 right away, there's rook takes c3, and now I can't go bishop e5 because there's rook takes f3 with check winning the house. So I played rook g3 first to defend the f3 pawn, to overprotect it. And then after rook c8, now I can go bishop f4. And after rook takes c3, which was played, I can go bishop e5, threaten the g7 pawn, and the f3 pawn is sufficiently defended. So just a little bit of sneaky multitasking. Now, I must say, in this position, I thought that I was winning, believe it or not, because I thought, okay, I have 3 attackers on the g7 pawn, and black has 2 defenders, and, you know, I thought this rook can't come back to b7, and this rook can't come to c7 because, you know, I can take it. So I thought, okay, this is just a winning position. How do you stop queen takes g7, or bishop takes g7? And then when I got to the position and thought about it for a moment, I realized that black had an amazing resource, which Bartek played almost instantly and just showed his class, which was rook c2 check first, pushing my king back to g1, and then rook c7. And rook c7 is a brilliant, brilliant move. Brilliant exchange sacrifice, because the point is that if I take this rook, I did not take it, but if I take it, now I don't have the same checkmating ideas anymore, and now the attack is pretty much stopped. And in the meantime, this b pawn is a runner, and my king is so naked that if the queen and the rook actually get in the game, I might get checkmated. So the issue is that in this position, black would actually be better. Not to mention the fact that this bishop on d5 is just a monster piece, eyeing the f3 pawn, so maybe even supporting the b pawn from getting pushed. So just a really, really dominating position. So after rook c7, it was kind of clear to me that, okay, I'm not better at all. I can't even take that exchange, and I'm not actually threatening g7 anymore because it's sufficiently defended. So I was like, oh man, I have to be really, really fast to get something going because my initiative is fizzling out. And then it occurred to me, I have one more piece I can pressure g7 with. And I tried to make that happen as quickly as possible. And I started with rook a1. Point is that my rook needs to get to the g file by any means necessary, because this pawn can just run up the board, and I don't really have the arsenal to stop it. If I try to bring my rooks around to stop this pawn, my position collapses. So I kind of just have to get my counterplay going on g7 as quickly as possible. Point is that I couldn't go to a2, which would be the quickest route, because bishop takes a2, so I had to go back to a1 and get my rook to the g file. So b4 was played, and now I went king h2, trying to get my rook to the g1 square as quickly as possible to get a 4th attacker on this g7 pawn. But now b3 was played, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's not even trying to defend the g7 pawn. He's just going to run his b pawn up the board. And here I had to think for a little while, because I was like, am I losing? Do I have enough on the g7 pawn? What's happening here? And I had to do a bit of calculation to see what the consequences were of this race, because it is a race. It's like, what's going to happen first? Am I going to get my pressure on the g7 pawn, or is he going to queen? What's the consequences? And it turns out that there is a very, very, very precise result here that you might actually want to think about. Maybe pause the video here for a minute or two and think about what you think the evaluation of this position is, because you can actually calculate this to the end. All right, well, hopefully you did, take a look at it, take a peek at it. I'm going to show you the rest of the moves because they're basically forced. I went rook AG1, again, now getting a fourth attacker into the game. So now I have 4 attackers, 2 blacks, 3 defenders. So what is the consequence of this? Black ignored it and went b2. Again, now b1 queen is a threat, and I can't stop it. So I just have to go forward. And I went queen takes g7 check, queen takes, and now rook takes g7. And now I'm actually threatening mate in 1. Note that if queen b1, I have rook takes c7 checkmate. So now black has to take on g7 with rook takes g7 again. And I go rook takes g7 and allow black to queen. Because in this position, after queen b1, after b1 queen, I have a saving grace, which is perpetual check. The point is that the king is stuck in a box here and can just go back and forth. So as long as I check anywhere on the G line, it's a draw. I went rook g6 check, and king h7 was played. And then after rook g7, king h8, and we agreed to a draw here. Pretty amazing game, because you could see that this race was kind of all of a sudden made things very, very crazy and very, very exacting. And it was like, if I didn't crash home on g7, I was going to lose. But I have just enough counterplay where I hold the game. I also want to give a shout out to my rook pawns in this game. I was completely lost, but the confusion created by pushing my a pawn to a6 and then pushing my h pawn to h5 gave me enough space and caused black enough problems where they got sufficiently distracted, and I was able to get the counterplay I needed with my terrible structure. So again, when you're worse or when you're losing, try to create some distractions, and sometimes things will happen. All right, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by checking out the PayPal link in the description below. All right, take care.